Amen. Thank you, Keith. Keith was in his 20s when I asked him to come down and share the ministry at First Baptist in Dallas with us, and he can still get people ready to open the book of God to the people of God, can't he? And so let's do that. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Habakkuk. Now, some of you scratching your head. If you get to Nahum, turn right. If you get to Zephaniah, turn left. You know, you better get to know what's in the book of Habakkuk, because you're liable to meet him in heaven one day and he's liable to say, well, what'd you think about my book? And you better know what to say. So I trust after these next few minutes that remain for us that when you meet Habakkuk, you'll have the grasp of what he's saying, because he has a word for us today here in the church. It's a privilege to be here in this place. I don't know of any other churches, a few maybe, but not many, who've had two pastors for 50 years. And two pastors that had the incredible integrity and servant heart and love for the church of God like Wayne Allen and Brent Taylor have had. So I hope you know how very blessed you are. And to have heard how I've heard all about the vision casting that went on last week, and how the church is marching forward to your new location in various ways, and all of the imagine that's been put before you by the pastor. You know, the birth of a vision and the reality of a vision is like the birth of a baby in so many ways. The first step in the birth of a baby is conception, when the seed of man and the egg of woman come together and the baby is conceived. And so it is with the birth of a vision. It begins in a church, usually with a pastor who has a heart for God and a heart for his people and a heart for the kingdom advancement. And alone with God, God plants a vision in his heart. But you know, he doesn't talk about it to begin with, because the next stage in the birth of a baby is gestation, where that lady for 9 months gestates that baby, and that baby begins to grow. And you know, after a few months, you can't see anything that's happening, but after a few months, you can tell that something's growing in her. And that's the way it is with a vision in the church. It's given to a pastor, and he gestates it, and it begins to grow, and we don't know what it is, but we know something's happening. Something's happening to our pastor. We can hear it in the messages. We know what's going on, and then it's birthed, like it was last week in your church. The baby comes forward. It's a boy, it's a girl, whatever, and the same is true in the church. When the vision is birthed and it's out there, next comes the most important stage, and that's adoption. When those who haven't personally birthed that baby take it as their very own with all legal rights. It's theirs. And so it is with a vision in a church, when the people of God adopt the vision that God has given to the pastor. Then comes the next stage, growth. We raised some daughters in our home. I don't know if you've ever raised kids, but you know what happens when they're growing? It costs money. It costs time. It costs energy. It costs work. And so it is in the growth of a vision. Why would the growth of a vision be any different than the growth of our kids? And then comes the stage of maturity, when everything you've hoped for and prayed for in that daughter comes to fruition, and you walk her down the aisle and you put her hand in the hand of somebody else. For me, it was like handing a Stradivarius to a gorilla, but I did it. And it reaches maturity. And you know, that's when a lot of churches cease to live. When everything they hoped for and dreamed about came to maturity, and then they just get comfortable. Because there's another stage, and that's reproduction. When those who've been birthed and grown and matured begin to reproduce other lives around them, and visions begin to reproduce. Now, along the way to seeing your vision become a reality, it's going to take a lot of focus. Because you know, there are a lot of things that'll come along to try to get the focus off the vision. Some things are good things that can do that. Some things are bad things that can do that. But things that come along to try to get our focus off from what God is seeking to try to do in the church. How many of you received a Federal Express package this week or sent one? You don't have to answer me. Just think about it. Do you know why that company has exploded and grown? Because of one word, focus. Fred Smith over there in Memphis, Tennessee decided to begin to send parcels and focus on one thing, overnight deliveries. And that company exploded because of focus. And anywhere you go in the world today, you see those big FedEx planes out on runways. Southwest Airlines. Why is it one of the most profitable airlines? Because of focus. They just decided to focus on coach travel and on-time deliveries, where you could pretty much know it's going to be on time and go. You know, 20 years ago, there was coffee shops in every small town in America, in every community in America, everything. You could go there and get breakfast. You could go there and get lunches and everything. And then Howard Schwartz came along and decided to focus on, of all things, in a coffee shop, coffee. And there's a Starbucks on almost every corner in America today, because of that one word, focus. This is what Paul was getting at in the 3rd chapter of Colossians when he said, set your mind, focus, set your mind on things above. This is what he was talking about in the 3rd chapter of Philippians when he said, well, I don't consider myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, not 10, not 5, not 4, not 2. This one thing, focus, I do. Forgetting what is behind, reaching forth to what is before, I press toward the mark. In Greek, skopos. It's like a scope on a rifle. And there's those crosshairs. And Paul said, you just got to put it right in the crosshairs. I press for the mark. This one thing I do. Focus. You know, when I came over here today driving in my car, I didn't drive all the way over here and get on George Bush Freeway and everything and keep looking in my rearview mirror. If I had, I'd have driven off the road. But I remember, you know, my high school driver's ed teachers always taught us, aim high in steering, focus out, way out there. And when you look forward, you keep that focus there. We're living in days of tremendous uncertainty. Economically, there's so much uncertainty economically. Nobody knows where the market's really going to go. There's so many dynamic factors in Europe and America that have brought such uncertainty economically. We're living in an uncertain world politically. Our political world is as uncertain as anything that's ever happened right now. Everything around us is a world of uncertainty. It's everywhere. It's uncertain socially. Moral fiber and fabric of this nation is being unraveled, and things we held true and moral stands we took not many years ago, now we see one after another diminishing in front of us. It's an uncertain world in which we're living. It's an uncertain world internationally, with rogue nations seeking to develop nuclear weapons. We live in uncertain times and an uncertain world. The same world Habakkuk was living in 2,600 years ago when he wrote this little 3-chapter book. In fact, if you look at the economic situation, the social situation, the moral situation, the international situation, everything that's going on in our lives today was going on in Israel when Habakkuk wrote this book. The Babylonians were about to come down, and they would eventually destroy the city of Jerusalem and take the Jews into Babylonian captivity. And it was such an uncertain time. Israel had lost its focus. And so Habakkuk writes this little book, and it's about focus. Because in the 1st chapter, we're going to see that some people focus on their circumstances. And all they do is just look at the problems there. And all their focus is on the circumstance, and it just brings confusion. Leads us to ask a bunch of questions can't be answered. In the 2nd chapter, we're going to see that some people focus through their circumstances. And that's what Habakkuk does in chapter 2. And then finally in chapter 3, we're briefly going to see that the best way to bring focus to our lives is to put our focus beyond the circumstance. where it brings clarity and comfort. So to begin with, I want us to look in chapter 1 briefly for just a moment to see that some people focus on their circumstance. And when they do, it only brings confusion. Look what he says in verse 1. The oracle, or the burden which Habakkuk did bear. He was living with a burden. He was living in uncertain times. The burden which Habakkuk did bear. Oh Lord, he said, how long am I going to cry out for help? And you will not hear. He's got his fist right in the face of God. Or cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at what's wrong? Destruction and violence, and he just goes on and on and on. Where are you, God, he says. Why don't you do something? In those times of uncertainty with Habakkuk, when the vision was being lost, when Babylon was coming down to just destroy the whole country and take them into captivity, he has got all of his focus now on the problem, on the situation, on the circumstance. I don't know about you, but you know I'm prone to do this. Somebody says something, ticks me off. Or somebody does something, or something happens in my life, or some misfortune comes, or some difficulty comes, or some sickness comes, and I'm so prone, if I'm not careful, to put all my attention on the problem. All my focus on the circumstance. That's what he's doing here. And so look what he says. Lord, how long am I going to keep crying out to you, and you will not save? How long? Why? Why don't you do something, God? He's asking questions that can't be answered. He's like Gideon was in Judges chapter 6, verse 13. When you remember what he asked there, he said, if the Lord is with us, why is all this happening to us? You ever ask that question? Judges 6:13. If the Lord is with me, why is all this happening? That's what he's doing here. His focus is on the circumstance, and it just brings confusion. It's leading him to ask a bunch of questions in chapter 1 that have no answers readily available. And you know what our general tendency is to blame others or to blame God. That's what he's doing. Where are you, God? Why do I keep crying out to you about violence? And you will not save. You will not answer. And so his focus is so consumed with the problem and the circumstance that he begins the blame game, and he begins to blame God. You know, just because you're in a difficult circumstance doesn't mean you're not in the middle of God's will. Because there are a couple of storms of life that can go. You know, there's summer storms of correction and summer storms of perfection. Remember Jonah? God told him to go in a certain direction. He went down to Joppa, got on a ship, and went in the opposite direction, away from the will of God by an act of his own will, and a storm came up, remember? And he was thrown overboard and swallowed by a great fish. Well, his was a storm of correction. When we're out of the will of God, sometimes storms come along to get us back going. Remember what happened? The fish regurgitated him, and he went straight to Nineveh where he was supposed to go, and a revival broke out. His was a storm of correction. But there are also storms of perfection. Remember up there in the Galilee, Jesus told the disciples one night, get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake, and I'll meet you there. And they did what Jesus told them to do. They were where Jesus told them to be. They were doing what he told them to do. And they got in a big storm, thought they were going to capsize, and got fearful for their lives. And he came walking on the water and stilled the storm. Said, oh, ye of little faith. That was a storm of perfection. They were in the will of God, doing what he wanted them to do. But he was perfecting their faith. Here in chapter 1, Habakkuk's got all of his focus on the circumstance. Moses sent the 12 spies, you remember, into Israel. 10 of them came back and focused on the problem. Well, they're giants over there. They make us look like grasshoppers. We can't do it. And so they saw the glass half empty. Joshua and Caleb came back. They didn't have their focus on the circumstance. They had their focus on God. And they said everything they said is true, but we can do it. We live in the promise of God. We can do it. Focus is vital in life, especially when a vision is before us. that the devil comes along in so many ways to get us off track and off course and off focus. Some focus on the circumstance. Now, if you continue to do that, you'll never get out of chapter 1. You'll live like Habakkuk, just asking a bunch of questions, why, that can't be answered. The question's not why, it's what. What are we going to learn from this to go forward and be more conformed to the image of Christ? But then we see something happening in the progression of Habakkuk's life. We come to chapter 2, and now we find him not focusing on the circumstance, but focusing through the circumstance. And when he focuses through the circumstance, he finds confidence. Look what he says in verse 4 of chapter 2. The just shall live by his faith. Man, he's come a long way by the time we get to chapter 2. Some of us need to, in our own personal lives, move from chapter 1 to chapter 2 and take our focus from being on the circumstance to putting it through the circumstance so that we too can find faith and confidence. How do we do that? There's some important steps we take. Step 1 is perspective. Look in verse 1. He says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to climb up in the watchtower. And I'm going to get up there and I'm going to wait to see what he will say to me. You know, if I were to take you to the land of Israel today, if you go up through Samaria, which many people don't do anymore, but there are a lot of watchtowers up there. You know, a guy owned a property, owned a field and everything. There are little buildings of native stone, circular buildings, maybe 10, 20, 15, 20 feet high, where that guy that owned the field could climb up in that watchtower and survey his crops. See if anybody was coming, any animals were destroying it. It was a place of elevated perspective, kind of like this platform is today. Now, what is Habakkuk saying? He's saying that perspective is important. He said, I'm going to climb up in the watchtower, and I'm going to wait to see what he will say to me. It's looking at things from God's perspective. You know, when our kids were little, we took them to Colorado Springs one time, did all those things tourists do in Colorado Springs. We went to the famous Seven Falls. I'll never forget it. We walk in, you go down through those big canyons and cliffs, and you go down that little curio shop in the bottom, and we got a brochure, and the girls were little, and it said on the brochure that right to the right of the top of the falls was a natural rock formation of a covered wagon. We were down there in the bottom where it was all coming into that pool, and we were looking up there, and they said, where is it, Daddy? Where is it, Daddy? And I gave them that old lie. Well, it's just right up there. Look, I never did see it. You know, it's just right up there. But a little bit later, we took that cable car. Now it's an elevator, but in those days, a cable car, and you could go up the other side of that cliff up there to about 200-foot elevation of an observation platform. And as soon as we stood off on that platform, on that observation deck, and looked across the canyon, there it was, plain as day. To the right of the falls, a natural rock formation of the covered wagon. It was there all the time. We just couldn't see it from that limited, puny perspective down in the valley. That's what Habakkuk is saying here. Look at your circumstance from God's perspective, not just your own. Not just being enveloped by focusing all the time on it. Look through it. Look from God's perspective. You need a biblical illustration of that? What about Joseph? Everything that happened to Joseph from the human perspective was bad. Jealousy's bad. Being thrown in a pit is bad. Having your coat stolen is bad. Having an animal slain, blood put on it, and lied to your daddy and told him you must have been killed by some animals. Here's your coat is bad. Having your dad live all those years thinking you were dead is bad. Being sold to the Ishmaelites is bad. Being taken down into Egypt in a foreign land with a foreign language is bad. Being put on a slave block and sold like an animal is bad. Having to serve as a slave in somebody's home is bad. Being falsely accused of something you didn't do is bad. Being thrown in prison. Everything that happened to Joseph from the human perspective was bad. But what did he say when he was revealed to his brothers in chapter 45? He said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And in chapter 50, he said, God sent me before you to preserve life. How could he say that? He was looking from God's perspective. So perspective is the first important thing. He said, I'm going to climb up there and wait to see what he will say to me. You know, so much of our time with God is about what we're saying to him or what we're saying to each other about him. And sometimes we need just perspective in life. We need to get up in a watchtower and wait to see what it says, what he will say to me. We have a God who speaks to us. How do you look through your difficulty? How do you put your focus through it, not on it? Perspective. Look from God's viewpoint. Second, patience. Look what he says in verse 3. Though the vision tarries, wait for it. You know, the true test of our Christian character may just be how we respond when we lose our blessings. Though the vision tarry, wait for it. I like what Psalm 130 says. It says, those who wait upon the Lord are like those who wait for the sun. One translation says, are like those who watch for the morning. You know, you can get out there in the morning. You can wake up 5 o'clock in the morning when the sun rises at about 6:30, 6:40 now. You can get out there at 5 o'clock and run your watch up to 6:30. But you know what? You can't hurry the sun. It ain't going to rise on your watch. Those that wait on the Lord are like those who watch for the morning. You're not going to hurry God. But I want to tell you something. There's never been a sunset yet not followed by a sunrise. Perspective, look from God's viewpoint. Patience, don't give up. Third, the promise. Look at the next part. Though the vision tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. Hold of the promises of God. You want to focus through your circumstance. You're in a problem today, and you want to focus through the circumstance. Perspective, look from God's viewpoint. Patience, promise. Though the vision tarry, it will surely come. You see, in the kingdom of God, we don't live by explanations. We live by promises. Naaman, remember Naaman, commander-in-chief of the king's armies of Syria over in the book of Kings? He almost missed his cure when he had leprosy. Why? Because he was looking for an explanation. And God just gave him a promise. Go dip 7 times in Jordan and you'll be clean. He almost missed it because he was wanting an explanation, and God gave him a promise. Here's the 4th step in focusing through your circumstance: participation. Look what it says in verse 4. The just shall live by his faith. You know, that may be one of the most misquoted verses in the Bible, because it doesn't say the just shall live by faith. It says the just shall live by his faith. Here is this element of participation. I don't have the love, but he does. I don't have the patience, but he does. I don't have the faith, but he does. And that's why Peter said in his epistle, we've been made partakers of divine nature. We can share in the very being of God. Here is this element of participation that the just live by his perfect faith. These 7 monosyllables, the just shall live by his faith. Participation. And a final step in chapter 2 is perception. We don't have time to deal with all of chapter 2. Just go down to the last verse. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Now, God didn't put that verse in the Bible so these high church people could have a liturgical song to sing. The Lord is in his holy temple, like they do. Why did he put that there? To remind us of perception, that God is still on the throne. God has not abdicated his throne. The Lord is still reigning on high. He is in control of this world. How do you put your focus from being on the circumstance and just being confused to putting your focus in chapter 2 through the circumstance and finding confidence? Well, you begin with perspective. You look from God's viewpoint. Patience, though the vision tarry, wait for it. Promise, it will surely come. Participation, Christ is with you. The just shall live by his perfect faith. And this element of perception, he has not advocated his throne, he's with you. God never promised to save you from your circumstances, but to save you through them. He didn't save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He didn't keep them out of the fiery furnace, but he got in there with them and saved them through it. Where's your focus? Because some focus on the circumstance, and that just brings confused in the midst of an uncertain world. Some focus through the circumstance and find confidence. But finally, there's even a better way to deal with it. And that's in chapter 3. And our time's almost gone. I don't have time to deal with it all. But I want to just show you some important verses in chapter 3. Because in chapter 3, what do we see Habakkuk doing? In chapter 1, he's putting all his focus on the circumstance. In chapter 2, he starts focusing through the circumstance. But now we get to chapter 3. His focus is beyond the circumstance. And because of that, he finds comfort and clarity. Look down in verse 17. Though the fig tree doesn't blossom, there be no fruit on the vines, the produce of the olive shall fail, the fields yield no fruit, the flock be cut off, there be no herd. If everything goes kaput. Now, wait a minute. This is the same guy that back there in chapter 1's got his fist in God's face. Saying, where are you, God? Why don't you do something? Why do I keep calling out and you don't answer? Now look what he's saying. If everything goes wrong, if there's no olives, if the fields yield no food, if the flocks are cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like deer's feet, hinds feet, and he makes me to lead upon mine high places. He's looking beyond. He's focusing beyond the circumstance. You know why I can say those two I wills in verse 18? I will rejoice and I will joy. You know why I can say those two I wills in verse 18? Because of the two he wills in verse 19. He will make my feet like deer's feet. You ever seen a deer scale over barbed wire fences or brush or bushes or something? How they can just jump with such agility and such beauty. He will make my feet like deer. He will give me the ability to overcome my circumstances. And look what it says. And he will lead me to my high places. You know, on that same trip to Colorado Springs with our kids when they were little, we took that cog train all the way up Pikes Peak. Everybody ought to do that once. If you ever do it twice, you need to make an appointment with a Christian psychologist somewhere. But we did it. And you know what happened? We got up there on that and we spooked some deer. And they took off running. You know where they ran? They didn't run down the mountain. They didn't run around the mountain. They ran up beyond the timberline, up where the air was pure, up where the hunters could not come. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will lead me to my high places. There's one little phrase that's on almost every page of this Bible. You know what it says? And it came to pass. And it came to pass. And it came to pass. I don't know your circumstance. I don't know your difficulty, but I know this. This too shall pass. And there's a better way to focus than focusing on your circumstance. And that's to keep your focus through the storm. But not just that, to keep it beyond the storm. Now let me just close by saying these are the three ways people in this room today are looking and focusing at the cross. You know, some people look at the cross and they just look at the cross. They put all their focus on the cross. And you know, it just brings confusion. This is what the disciples did. What does it say? It says they all forsook him and fled. What did those two Emmaus disciples say on the Emmaus Road? They said, we had what? We'd hoped he'd been the one. But they left that hope buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. What Peter said, he said, I'm going fishing. I'm going back to the fishing business. If you're just here today and your focus at the cross is just on the cross, at the cross, it'll just bring confusion. But you know, there was one who focused through the cross. That's what Jesus did in Gethsemane's garden. Hear him as he sweat drops of blood. Hear him as he prayed, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. He focused through the cross. And that's where he won the victory of Calvary. But even there's a better way. And that's the focus beyond the cross. This is what he did. This is why the writer of Hebrews said in chapter 12, verse 2 of Hebrews, that for the joy that was set where? Before him. He endured the cross, despising the shame, and is now seated at the right hand of the Father. What is your primary purpose in life? Where's your focus in life? You know, everything has a primary focus. I got a pen in my pocket right now. It's a little old plastic Sharpie. but it writes every time I pull it out. I've got an expensive German pen somebody gave me one time years ago that skips all the time. I'd rather have a plastic pen like this that writes every time than an old German pen that didn't write. Because the primary purpose of a pen is to write. I got here today in my car. It's a Ford product. You know, I'd rather drive an old Chevrolet that started every time it got up than to have a new fancy foreign car that didn't even start half the time. Why? Because the primary purpose of a car is to get me from point A to point B. What's your primary purpose in life? What are you doing in life? Nobody has a DNA like yours. Nobody's got a thumbprint like yours. You're an individual, indescribably valuable to God. Nobody has a DNA like yours. Think about that. Of 7 billion people in this planet, you are unique. Why? God made you that way. Because there's a primary purpose in life, and that is to know Him. Whom to know is life. He wants you to know Him in the free pardoning of sin. He's got a brand new beginning for you. Are you focused? What's in the crosshairs of your life? Well, I want to tell you something right now. Jesus is focused. And Jesus is focused on you. And you're not here by coincidence, because He brought you here. Because you are in the crosshairs of His scope. He loves you. He's got a brand new beginning for you.